The rope bit deep into Clara Colette's wrists as she stood beneath the merciless Arizona sun, her bare feet bleeding on the rocky ground of Willow Springs' Main Street. Every breath felt like swallowing molten copper, and the jeering faces of the townspeople swam through her tears of fury and humiliation. 3 weeks ago, she had stepped off the stagecoach from St. Louis, carrying hope in her carpetbag and marriage papers that promised a new life with a prosperous rancher. Now those same papers lay crumpled in the dust, revealed as forgeries, while Victor Klaus stood at the crowd's edge, drinking in her degradation like fine whiskey. Theft and corruption of public morals. Sheriff Otto announced, his voice carrying across the street with theatrical precision. That's what happens when foreign women think they can break lawful contracts and steal from honest American businessmen. Clara's jaw clenched until her teeth ached. She had watched Klaus alter those documents with her own eyes, seen him change dates and signatures when she discovered the marriage was a sham. But who would believe a German immigrant against the territory's richest cattle baron? Lies, she whispered, then louder, her accent thickening with rage. All lies, and you notice is true, you bastard. I see you make false papers. Klaus stepped closer, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence that came from owning half the territory and terrorizing the other half into submission. Despite the desert heat, his wool suit remained immaculate gold watch chain, gleaming like a badge of untouchable power. Careful, Liebchen, he said, using the German endearment like a blade. Judge Morrison arrives tomorrow to hear your case. Wouldn't want to worsen your situation with wild accusations. The threat made Clara's blood turn to ice. She had seen what happened to women who crossed Victor Klaus. Maria Santos had questioned her employment terms. They found her in the river 3 days later. Sarah Mackenzie had tried to organize the other captive women. She simply vanished, and anyone who asked questions learned to stop asking. A movement near the livery stable caught her attention. An Apache warrior emerged into the blazing sunlight, and the crowd's murmur died like a snuffed candle. He was tall and lean, perhaps 30 years old, with weathered buckskin clothing and a magnificent feathered headdress that rose 3 feet above his head. A Spencer carbine was slung across his back, and a cavalry canteen hung beside a massive Bowie knife at his hip. A pale scar traced down his left forearm, where an old bullet had found its mark. The Apache walked through the parting crowd as if they were ghosts, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Clara. There was something in his gaze, recognition perhaps, or simple human dignity, in a place where such qualities had become extinct. He stopped directly before her, close enough that she could smell sage smoke and leather on his clothes. When he reached out to lift her chin with calloused fingers, she flinched. "Don't look at me," she whispered in German, then English. "Please, I am nothing now." But he looked anyway, not with the crowd's cruel curiosity or Klaus's possessive hunger, but with something that made her throat tighten. Respect. For someone who had endured more than anyone should bear and was still standing. "You're mine now," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the silent street. "Under my protection." The effect was explosive. Someone screamed. Glass shattered as a bottle burst against the water trough. Mrs. Henderson fainted dead away, her parasol flying. "Kill the savage," Greasy Pete yelled, drawing his Colt with practiced speed. But the Apache was already moving. His Bowie knife appeared like magic, slicing through Clara's bonds with 2 quick cuts. As blood rushed back into her hands, he swept her into his arms with fluid grace. Gunshots cracked across the street. A bullet whined past Clara's ear, while another kicked dust at their feet. The crowd scattered in panic as Klaus's men opened fire, but the Apache pushed through them, carrying Clara toward his horse with deadly purpose. "Hold tight," he said, lifting her onto a sturdy dun mare. This is only the beginning. Clara pressed against his shoulder as they galloped from town, her heart pounding with terror and something that might have been hope. Behind them, Klaus's voice rose above the chaos, promising rewards for their capture and describing tortures that would make her previous suffering seem merciful. For the first time in 3 weeks, she was free. By evening, they had reached the Ash River, running brown and sluggish between cottonwood-lined banks. The Apache, she still didn't know his name, guided his horse carefully into the water, testing each step on the rocky bottom. "My name is Atsadi," he said as they crossed. "My people call me this because it means fire. The white men call me Lone Wolf because they cannot speak our words. I am Clara Colette." She replied, her German accent making the words musical despite their gravity. "But why did you help me? You don't know me. I could be criminal jaw dangerous woman who deserve what happened." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried careful weight. "I have a sister. Her name is Winona. She disappeared 2 months ago near Copper Gulch mining camp." His voice remained steady, but she heard the pain beneath. "Last anyone saw her, she was asking about work for women in the camps. I have been searching, following cold trails and false hopes." Clara understood immediately. "You think maybe someone help her if they can. So you help me hoping for—" She searched for the English word. "Karma to return Maybe. Or maybe some things are just right to do regardless of what we get back." They were halfway across when hoofbeats announced pursuit. 3 riders burst from the trees, led by Pete with his scarred face twisted in fury. "Give it up, Apache," Pete shouted, trying to aim while controlling his horse in the current. "That woman's got a legal husband waiting." Atsadi pulled his Spencer carbine and fired in one smooth motion. The heavy bullet took Pete in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle into the rushing water with a tremendous splash. "Can you pass me cartridges?" Atsadi asked calmly, as if bullets weren't splashing around them. Clara's seamstress training had given her steady hands. She managed to extract brass shells from his saddlebag while their enemies regrouped on the far bank. "Good," he said as she pressed ammunition into his palm. "Now keep low." They reached safety as Pete's men dragged their leader from the water. But the river crossing had cost them supplies they couldn't afford to lose bedroll, and precious flour carried away by the current. Clara shivered in her wet dress as they sheltered in a cottonwood grove. Atsadi noticed immediately and began cutting strips from his coat lining to wrap her bleeding feet. "Klaus took my shoes when I first tried to run," she explained, wincing as he cleaned the cuts. "Said I run better without. Really, he just want me remember I am property like cow or horse." "What was he like?" Atsadi asked as he worked. "This Klaus, how did he trap you?" Clara's face darkened. "He writes beautiful letters, promising marriage, good life, ranch house with servants. I come from Bremen, where my father is tailor, but business is bad since the war. Too many mouths to feed, not enough work." She paused, watching Atsadi's careful hands. "Klaus, he makes everything sound like fairy tale. American dream, they call it. But when I arrive, it was all lies. Worse than lies. He has system. Papers that look legal but are fake. Sheriff who pretends not to see. Women kept locked up until they stopped fighting or—" She swallowed hard. "Until they disappear completely." Atsadi finished wrapping her feet and sat back on his heels. "You said until they disappear. Where do they go?" "I don't know for certain. but I hear Klaus talking sometimes when he thinks I cannot understand English well. He mentions camps buyers girls who bring good prices because they are exotic. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. I think your sister, she might be caught in same trap. The implications hung heavy between them as darkness fell over the desert. They were not just fleeing Klaus's immediate revenge, they were confronting something larger and more systematic than either had imagined. We need shelter, Atsadi said, scanning the darkening landscape. And people who won't sell us to Klaus for reward money. Is there such people here? Maybe. Walter Remy, a farmer about 5 miles north. He has reasons to hate Klaus, been fighting over water rights for 2 years. As if summoned by his words, distant hoofbeats reminded them their pursuers hadn't given up. They mounted and rode through gathering darkness toward uncertain sanctuary. Walter Remy's cabin glowed like a beacon across the prairie when they finally spotted it. The farmer himself appeared at the door, a thin man in his 40s, with weathered hands and honest eyes. Heard shooting, Walter said, ushering them inside, where his wife Mary waited with hot coffee and worried expressions. Klaus's men been asking questions all day about strangers passing through. We don't want to bring trouble on your family, Clara began, but Walter cut her off. Klaus has been trying to steal my water for 2 years. Poisoned 3 of my wells, burned my crops, twice threatened my boy. His jaw tightened. Bastard thinks he owns the whole territory. Any enemy of Klaus is welcome at my table. Mary Remy served them hot stew and fresh bread, while Walter spoke quietly with Atsadi about the best route to avoid Klaus's patrols. Clara found herself watching the farmer's wife, a woman perhaps 10 years her senior, who moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to make do with little, but make it well. You're not what I expected, Mary said, suddenly settling beside Clara with her own cup of coffee. What did you expect? The way Klaus's men were describing you. Well, let's just say they made you sound like a dangerous criminal instead of a woman who had sense enough to run from a bad situation. Clara felt tears threatening. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with simple human kindness. Sometimes I think maybe I am crazy woman jaw. Maybe I deserve what happened because I was so stupid to believe his lies. That's nonsense, Mary said firmly. Klaus has been preying on women for years. You're just the first one brave enough to fight back openly. She lowered her voice. There have been others, you know. Women who answered his advertisements, came west expecting marriage, and found something else. What happened to them? Mary's face grew grim. Some died, some just vanished. The lucky ones escaped, though not many were lucky. That night, lying in the Remy's hayloft with that Sadi keeping watch nearby, Clara found herself thinking about all the women who hadn't been fortunate enough to have an Apache warrior intervene at the crucial moment. How many were still trapped? How many would never escape? You are thinking loud thoughts, Atsadi said softly. What troubles you besides the obvious? Clara rolled over to face him in the darkness. All those other women. If Klaus has been doing this for years, there must be so many. She struggled with the English words. How do we help them? How do we stop him? First we survive, then we find my sister. Then maybe we can do something about the rest. You make it sound simple. Nothing about this is simple. But sometimes the only way through impossible situation is one step at a time. Dawn brought fresh danger. Pete and 2 new riders, professional bounty hunters drawn by Klaus's money, caught them on the freight road to Sable Junction. $50 for the Apache, $25 for the woman, called one hunter a lean man with pale killer's eyes. Dead or alive, don't matter to Klaus anymore. The road offered little cover, just sagebrush and scattered rocks between them and their destination. Atsadi studied their tactical situation with experienced eyes. When shooting starts, get to those rocks, he told Clara, pointing to an outcropping 30 yards away. I don't run while you fight alone, she replied with surprising firmness. We are partners now. Job partners stick together. Her use of that word partners struck him as significant. In Apache culture, it suggested equality rather than the white world's assumption that men protected helpless women. The first bounty hunter fell to Atsadi's precise rifle work, but the second tried flanking their position. Clara led Atsadi's horse directly into the man's path and stabbed the animal's shoulder with her seamstress awl, bringing both horse and rider down hard. The fallen hunter tried to rise, dazed and bleeding. Clara picked up a fist-sized rock and brought it down with all her strength, driven by weeks of accumulated rage and the knowledge that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. You did what was necessary, Atsadi said as they searched the bodies for supplies. Out here, that's what matters. Clara stared at the blood on her hands, the reality sinking in. I never killed anyone before. Neither had I until men tried to kill me first. Some lines once crossed change you forever. But the alternative is dying, and that helps nobody. They took what they could use from the dead men, ammunition, food, and water, and then continued towards Sable Junction as more riders appeared on the horizon behind them. Sable Junction crouched beside the railroad tracks, like a collection of wooden boxes existing solely to serve freight traffic between mining camps and the outside world. Helen Beatrice lived behind the schoolhouse, a woman of 32 who had chosen education over marriage, valuing independence above security. The general store sat at the town's heart, a substantial building that also housed the telegraph office. Behind the counter stood a mild-mannered man in his late 30s with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. His shirt was clean but showed the careful mending that spoke of modest means. "Welcome to Sable Junction," he said with a friendly smile as Clara and Atsadi approached cautiously. "I'm Elias Vance, proprietor of this establishment and part-time telegraph operator. You folks look like you've had a rough journey." There was something immediately trustworthy about Elias, the way he kept his hands visible, spoke in calm, measured tones, and didn't seem disturbed by Atsadi's presence the way most white men did. His eyes held the tired kindness of someone who had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. "We're looking for Helen Beatrice, the schoolteacher," Clara said carefully. "Ah, Miss Beatrice. Fine woman, very dedicated to her students." Elias glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer conspiratorially. "Might I ask what brings you to seek her out? We don't get many visitors, especially not." He gestured vaguely at their travel-stained appearance. When Clara hesitated, Atsadi stepped forward slightly. "We have mutual acquaintances, people who value Miss Beatrice's work with literacy and education." Of course. Elias nodded enthusiastically. "She's doing important work here, helping children who might otherwise never learn their letters. You'll find her behind the schoolhouse in the small frame house. Though," his brow furrowed with what appeared to be genuine concern, "I should warn you there's been some trouble lately. Federal marshals came through yesterday asking questions about strangers, particularly anyone matching your descriptions." The warning seemed to come from genuine caring, and Clara felt her shoulders relax slightly. After so much hostility and danger, finding someone who seemed genuinely helpful was almost overwhelming. "Thank you for the warning," she said, We'll be careful. Please do. And if you need anything, food supplies, a place to rest, don't hesitate to ask. We decent folks have to look out for each other in times like these. Elias straightened a display of canned goods, his movements casual, but his eyes alert. Might I ask where you're traveling from? Just curiosity, you understand. We don't get much news from the outside. Something flickered across his face when Clara mentioned Willow Springs, just a momentary tightness around the eyes that he quickly covered with an expression of sympathy. Willow Springs. That's Klaus country, isn't it? Terrible business what I hear about that man's activities. Elias shook his head sadly. A man like that gives honest ranchers a bad name. I hope you weren't. I hope you didn't have any unpleasant encounters with his organization. We managed to avoid trouble, Atsadi said simply. Good. Where might you be heading next, if you don't mind my asking? The railroad can take you east or west, though schedules are irregular this time of year. The question seemed innocent enough, but Clara noticed Atsadi's subtle shift in posture, not quite suspicious, but more alert than he had been moments before. We haven't decided yet, Clara replied. We'll see what opportunities present themselves. Of course. Well, I'll let you get on to Miss Beatrice. She should be finishing her evening lessons about now. Elias smiled warmly. And remember, if you need anything at all, just come find me. I'm usually here from dawn until well after dark. As they left the store, Clara felt oddly comforted by the encounter. In a territory where so many people seemed either corrupt or terrified, finding someone willing to offer help without obvious ulterior motives felt like a small miracle. They found Helen Beatrice in her kitchen, where she was waiting with coffee already brewing, and the smell of fresh bread filling the warm air. I heard you were coming, Helen said, ushering them inside quickly. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves an Apache warrior and a German woman traveling together. Helen was a precise woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of controlled energy that came from having strong opinions and the education to express them clearly. She moved with purpose as she set out cups and plates, but Clara noticed the way she kept glancing toward the windows. Dr. Marcel is coming, Helen continued, and we don't have much time before the morning train arrives from Silver City with more federal agents. How do you know about the agents? Atsadi asked. Because I've been documenting Klaus's activities for months, and someone in the territorial government has finally started paying attention. Helen spread papers across her kitchen table, documents she had copied or stolen from various offices, building a case that revealed Klaus's crimes extending far beyond Clara's situation. This page from Judge Dietrich's ledger shows when Klaus's marriage papers were supposedly witnessed, she explained. But this railroad manifest proves Klaus was in Denver, those same dates negotiating cattle contracts. Clara studied the evidence with her seamstress eye for detail. The ink is different too. See how this signature is darker. Someone added it later after the original was filed. Exactly. Klaus's people have been altering records for months, maybe years. Helen pulled out more documents. But there's something else. I've been tracking patterns in his business dealings, and I think there's something much larger happening here. She showed them shipping records, freight manifests, and correspondence that painted a disturbing picture. Women aren't just disappearing locally. They're being moved, transported like cargo to destinations I haven't been able to trace yet. How many women? Clara asked quietly. At least 7 in the past year that I can document. But I suspect there are more, many more. Helen's voice carried the frustration of someone who understood the scope of a problem but lacked the power to address it. The territorial authorities I've contacted either don't believe me or—" She paused significantly. "Or they're part of the problem." Dr. Marcel arrived as dawn lightened the sky, a precise man with tired eyes who had seen too much frontier suffering. He examined Clara's injuries with professional detachment, documenting everything for potential legal proceedings. The bruising pattern suggests repeated blows with a blunt object. He said, making notes. "Rope burns forced marching without shoes. I can testify to systematic abuse if courts will listen." "Will anyone believe it?" Clara asked. "Evidence accumulates. Eventually, even corrupt officials must pay attention when documentation becomes overwhelming." As they prepared to leave Sable Junction on the westbound freight train, Helen pressed a leather portfolio into Clara's hands. "More evidence," she explained. "If anything happens to me, get this to Marshal Dietrich in Timberline. He's one of the few lawmen who can't be bought." They were making their way toward the train yard when Elias Vance appeared slightly out of breath, as if he had been hurrying to catch them. "I'm so glad I found you," he said, his face creased with worry. "I just received a telegraph message. There are federal marshals on that westbound train, and they have descriptions of you both. Someone must have warned them you were coming this way." Clara felt her heart sink. Another close escape, another near miss. But Elias was already thinking ahead. "There's a freight train leaving for Copper Gulch in about an hour. It's not comfortable, but it might be safer than the passenger service." He glanced around nervously. "I could help you get aboard without being seen if you'd like." "Why would you help us?" Atsadi asked directly. Elias was quiet for a moment, then spoke with what seemed like painful honesty. "I've seen what Klaus does to people who cross him. If you're running from him, you have my sympathy and whatever help I can provide." "How do you know about Klaus?" Clara pressed. "This is a small territory. Word gets around about men like that." Elias's jaw tightened. "I lost a cousin to his organization 2 years ago. Young woman who answered one of his advertisements. We never found out what happened to her." The personal connection seemed to explain his willingness to help, and his plan made tactical sense. Within the hour, they were hidden among lumber and mining equipment, in a freight car bound for the mining camps of the high country. As their train pulled away from Sable Junction, Clara caught a glimpse of Elias standing near the telegraph office watching their departure, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something about his posture seemed different, less relaxed than it had been during their conversations, more alert and purposeful. But the observation was fleeting, lost in the relief of another successful escape, and the growing certainty that they were moving closer to answers about Winona's fate and the true scope of Klaus's criminal enterprise. The freight train carried them through increasingly desolate country as afternoon turned to evening. Atsadi sat quietly lost in thought, while Clara tried to process everything they had learned. The evidence Helen had shown them painted a picture far more complex and far-reaching than simple marriage fraud or even isolated kidnapping. "Atsadi," she said finally, "what if we're not just rescuing your sister? What if we're walking into something much bigger?" "I've been thinking the same thing," he replied. "But bigger or not, Winona is still out there, and now we know she's not alone." As darkness fell over the desert landscape, both of them understood they were approaching not just a rescue mission, but a confrontation with forces that had been operating with impunity for far too long. Whatever they found at Copper Gulch would determine not just Winona's fate, but the fate of countless other women caught in Klaus's web. The train's whistle echoed off canyon walls as they climbed into mining country, carrying 2 people who had already been changed by their journey and were about to be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 20 miles from Copper Gulch, something made Atsadi uneasy enough to insist they jump from the slowly moving train and approach their destination on foot. Perhaps it was warrior instinct, or perhaps it was the way certain details from their conversation with Elias had begun to trouble him during the long, quiet hours of travel. "Something feels wrong," he said as they gathered their few possessions in the swaying freight car. "That man back in Sable Junction, Elias. Did you notice how he asked specific questions about our plans?" Clara frowned, thinking back. He seemed concerned for our safety. Asked where we were going so he could help us avoid trouble. Maybe. But in my experience, helpful strangers who ask many questions are often not as helpful as they seem. They jumped from the train at a water stop and began walking back towards Sable Junction under cover of darkness, following game trails and dry washes that would hide their movement from anyone watching the main roads. It was near midnight when they reached the outskirts of the town, moving like ghosts through the scattered buildings and empty lots that marked Sable Junction's periphery. Most windows were dark, but light showed from behind the general store where the telegraph office operated, unusual for such a late hour. What they found in the alley behind the store confirmed Atsadi's worst suspicions and shattered Clara's faith in her ability to judge character. A covered wagon waited in the shadows, its canvas top concealing whatever cargo lay within. Elias Vance stood beside it, no longer the mild-mannered shopkeeper they had met earlier. His posture was different, nervous and furtive, as he spoke in low, urgent tones with two rough-looking men who clearly weren't local residents. "I told you they were heading for Copper Gulch," Elias was saying. "Klaus wants them stopped before they reach the mining camp. Too many people asking questions up there already." One of the men spat into the dust. "Should have kept them here instead of letting them get on that train. I couldn't risk it with the federal marshals in town, but this way is better make it look like an accident in the wilderness. No one asks questions about travelers who disappear between settlements." Clara felt sick not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that they had walked willingly into Elias's trap, sharing their plans and accepting his help, while he reported their every move to Klaus. How many other people had trusted him? How many had died because of his information? Atsadi motioned for her to stay hidden while he moved closer, trying to get a better look at the wagon's contents. What he saw made his blood run cold. Through a gap in the canvas covering, he could see two young women bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror in the moonlight. One appeared to be Mexican, perhaps 16 years old. The other was clearly Native American, possibly Apache, though it was difficult to tell in the poor light. This wasn't just about information gathering. Elias was actively participating in Klaus's trafficking operation, using his position as telegraph operator and store owner to identify vulnerable women and coordinate their capture and transport. The realization transformed what had been a matter of personal justice into something much larger and more urgent. These weren't just criminals they were dealing with. This was a network that reached into every level of territorial society, from corrupt sheriffs to helpful shopkeepers to federal officials who asked too many questions. Atsadi rejoined Clara in the shadows and quickly explained what he had observed. Her face went white with shock and self-recrimination. "I trusted him," she whispered. "He seemed so kind, so concerned. How could I be so stupid?" "Because good people want to believe in other good people," Atsadi replied. "That's not stupidity, it's hope. But now we know better, and we can use that knowledge." They waited until the two hired guns had gone inside the store, probably to collect payment or receive further instructions. Then they moved swiftly toward the wagon, knowing they had only minutes before discovery became inevitable. The two captive women shrank back in terror when Atsadi's shadow fell across them, expecting more violence from their captors. But Clara spoke quickly in Spanish and English, explaining they were there to help, while Atsadi cut their bonds with his knife. "Por favor, no grittin'," Clara whispered urgently. "We are friends. We help you escape, but you must be very quiet." The younger woman, the Mexican girl, nodded frantically and immediately began helping free her companion, but it was the Apache woman who provided the information that changed everything. When she saw Atsadi clearly in the moonlight, recognition dawned in her eyes. She spoke rapidly in what Clara assumed was Apache, her voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency. "What is she saying?" Clara asked. Atsadi's face had gone rigid with controlled emotion. "She says she was held with my sister until 3 days ago. She describes Winona perfectly, including a piece of beadwork she always wears, white and blue and red beads in the pattern of water flowing over stones." He listened as the woman continued speaking, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to share what she knew. "Winona is alive." He translated, his voice thick with relief and renewed determination. "She's at Copper Gulch, being held with at least 12 other women in a stone building near the mine entrance. But they're planning to move all of them soon, within days, to buyers in California who pay premium prices for what they call exotic specimens." The Apache woman grabbed Atsadi's arm and spoke again, this time with fierce intensity. "She says Winona told her that her brother would come, that she should watch for an Apache warrior who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. She says Winona never lost faith, even when the others gave up hope." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes at the image of Winona maintaining hope in the face of unimaginable horror, believing in her brother's promise to find her, even when rescue seemed impossible. But their emotional reunion was interrupted by voices from inside the store. Elias and his associates were returning to the wagon. "Take them to the old mill," Clara whispered, pointing toward an abandoned building she had noticed earlier. "I'll create a distraction to give you time." "What kind of distraction?" Atsadi asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "The kind that lets Elias Vance know exactly what we think of traitors," Clara replied grimly. Before Atsadi could object, she was moving toward the store's back entrance, her seamstress awl in her hand, and a look of cold determination on her face that reminded him why he had been drawn to help her in the first place. What followed was brief but decisive. Clara confronted Elias just as he emerged from the store, the sight of her causing him to stumble backward in shock and terror. "You," she said simply, her German accent thickening with rage. "You lying, betraying piece of filth." Elias's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as he realized his deception had been discovered. "Clara, I can explain." "Explain how you sell women like cattle. Explain how you smile and offer help while reporting to Klaus." She stepped closer, and Elias backed against the store wall. "Explain how you sleep at night, knowing what happens to girls you help capture." The confrontation brought the two hired guns running, but Atsadi was ready for them. His Spencer spoke twice in rapid succession, and both men went down hard, their weapons clattering uselessly across the wooden planks of the store's loading dock. Elias, trapped and terrified, began talking rapidly, desperation making him careless with information he had previously guarded carefully. "I never wanted this," he babbled. "Klaus owns my gambling debts, thousands of dollars I can never repay. He said just pass along information, keep track of strangers, nothing more. But then he wanted me to help with the transports, and I couldn't refuse without..." "Without what?" Atsadi demanded, his knife now pressed against Elias's throat. "Without him killing me and finding someone else to do the job. You don't understand how big this operation is, how many people are involved. Klaus has connections everywhere: judges, marshals, railroad officials, mining supervisors. The whole territory is riddled with his people. Tell us about Copper Gulch, Clara said. Everything you know. Under the pressure of Atsadi's blade and their obvious willingness to use violence, Elias provided details that painted a horrifying picture of Klaus's enterprise. The mining camp served as more than just a collection point. It was a processing center where women were trained for specific buyers, their spirits broken and their identities erased before shipment to private collections throughout the West. There's a shipment leaving in 2 days, Elias whispered. 20 women, including several Apache and Mexican girls that bring premium prices. They're going to a man called the Colonel in Santa Fe, who distributes them to wealthy collectors in California and Colorado. How many guards at the camp? Atsadi asked. 8 or 10 regular men, plus Klaus himself and Greasy Pete. They don't expect trouble. The camp is isolated, and most people are too frightened of Klaus to interfere. But even as Elias talked, Clara could see calculation in his eyes, the look of a man trying to figure out how to survive this encounter and possibly turn it to his advantage. She had trusted him once and been betrayed. She wouldn't make that mistake again. What do we do with him? She asked Atsadi. That we leave him for the territorial marshals, Atsadi replied. Tied up with enough evidence to ensure he faces justice for his crimes. They bound Elias securely and left him in his own store with a note explaining his role in Klaus's organization and detailing the location of the evidence they had gathered. The 2 rescued women would serve as witnesses, along with the shipping records and correspondence they had found in the wagon. But Clara knew their confrontation with Elias had cost them something precious, the element of surprise. By now, Klaus would know they were coming to Copper Gulch. He would be prepared for them, ready with superior numbers and defensive positions. He'll be waiting for us, she said as they prepared to leave Sable Junction behind forever. Yes, Atsadi agreed. But now we know what we're truly fighting against. And sometimes that's worth more than surprise. As they began the long journey toward Copper Gulch, carrying new knowledge and renewed determination, both understood they were no longer just trying to rescue one person. They were challenging an entire system of exploitation and corruption that had been operating in darkness for too long. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also revealed the true scope of their enemy and the stakes involved in their mission. Whatever happened at Copper Gulch would determine not just Winona's fate, but the fate of every woman trapped in Klaus's network of systematic brutality. And for the first time since their desperate flight from Willow Springs had begun, both Clara and Atsadi felt they had a real chance of achieving something more than mere survival. They might actually be able to strike a blow for justice that would resonate far beyond their personal circumstances. The mining camp at Copper Gulch sprawled across a scarred hillside, like an infected wound that had never properly healed, its collection of ramshackle buildings and rusted equipment testimony to years of hard extraction and even harder living. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys despite the summer heat, and the constant sound of machinery echoed off the canyon walls. Steam engines or crushers and the rhythmic pounding of stamp mills that worked around the clock to squeeze every ounce of precious metal from the stubborn rock. Atsadi had spent most of the previous night moving like a ghost through this industrial wasteland, using techniques learned during years of hunting both animals and men, in terrain far more challenging than these man-made obstacles. What he discovered during his reconnaissance confirmed their worst fears, while adding new layers of horror to Klaus's operation that none of them had fully anticipated. The women were being held in a converted ore storage building near the mine's main entrance, a stone structure with barred windows and heavy wooden doors that had been reinforced with iron strapping to prevent any possibility of escape from within. Through cracks in the boarded windows, Atsadi had counted at least 15 captives. and the Apache woman's description had been accurate. This was where Winona was being held. 2 armed guards maintained constant watch over the converted prison, making regular circuits around the building, while a 3rd man stayed inside what appeared to be a makeshift guard station, equipped with rifles, ammunition, and supplies for an extended siege if necessary. The guards were professionals, alert and well-armed, with the kind of casual competence that suggested extensive experience in handling captive women who might be desperate enough to attempt escape despite the consequences. But Atsadi had also noticed something that might provide the opportunity they needed if they were willing to accept enormous risks and trust their lives to factors beyond their control. The mine's drainage system was inadequate for the summer storms that periodically swept down from the high country, and recent heavy rains had left the lower tunnels partially flooded with water that had nowhere to go except deeper into the mountain's interior. He was making his way back to where Clara and Helen waited in their hidden camp among the juniper trees when the attack came without any warning whatsoever. Greasy Pete rose from behind a boulder like an avenging demon, his face a map of fresh scars and old hatred, his right arm still in a sling, but his left hand holding a Colt revolver with rock-steady determination. 6 men emerged from concealment around him, all armed with rifles and shotguns, all positioned to create a crossfire that would make escape impossible for anyone caught in the open between them. These weren't the semi-competent bounty hunters they had faced on the freight road. These were Klaus's personal enforcers, men who had been hunting Apache and Mexican revolutionaries for years and knew how to set an ambush that would hold against even the most skilled and desperate opposition. End of the trail. Apache. Pete snarled, blood seeping through the bandages that covered the left side of his head, where Atsadi's earlier bullet had grazed his skull and left him with permanent scars that would remind him of this humiliation for the rest of his life. Klaus wants you alive so he can make you pay proper for all the trouble you caused, but he didn't say you had to be in good condition when we bring you in. The first shots came before Atsadi could reach adequate cover bullets, whining off the rocks around him as he dove behind a fallen log that provided minimal protection against the sustained fire that immediately erupted from multiple directions. From their hidden position 50 yards away, Clara and Helen heard the gunfire and understood immediately that their carefully planned approach to the mining camp had just collapsed into deadly chaos. "We have to help him," Clara said, reaching for the Spencer carbine they had taken from the bounty hunters on the freight road. But Helen grabbed her arm with the firm grip of someone accustomed to maintaining discipline among unruly children, her schoolteacher instincts overriding her emotional response to the crisis developing before their eyes. "Wait. If we rush in blindly, we'll just give them more targets without improving the tactical situation. Let's see what develops before we commit ourselves to a course of action we can't reverse." Walter Remy had followed them from his farm, despite the obvious dangers and his complete lack of experience in this kind of violence, driven by a combination of personal loyalty and his own burning desire to see Victor Klaus brought to justice for years of systematic harassment and intimidation. The old farmer had brought his squirrel rifle and a grim determination to see the fight through regardless of the personal cost. But he was no gunfighter, and his weapon was designed for hunting small game rather than engaging armed men in serious combat. Still, when he saw Atsadi pinned down by superior numbers, in a position where he would eventually be overwhelmed unless something dramatic happened to change the tactical balance, Walter didn't hesitate to act according to his conscience rather than his limitations. He worked his way through the rocks to a position where he could provide covering fire, then opened up on Pete's men with careful aimed shots that might not hit much, but would force them to take cover and reduce the intensity of fire directed at Atsadi. "This way," Walter called to the Apache, gesturing toward a narrow gully that would provide a covered route back toward the women's position and temporary safety from the crossfire that was chewing up the landscape around them. But Pete had anticipated exactly this kind of maneuver, positioning his men to cover the most likely escape routes, while keeping enough reserves to handle unexpected developments. As Atsati broke from cover and sprinted toward the gully, Walter had indicated Pete's rifle spoke with the authority of years of experience shooting fleeing men, and Walter Remy pitched forward with a .44 caliber bullet in his gut, his own weapon flying from his hands as he collapsed behind a pile of mine tailings. Walter. Helen screamed, starting forward despite the danger and the tactical situation that made rescue impossible without getting herself killed in the process. Clara caught her and held her back while working the Spencer's lever action. But her inexperience with the heavy rifle showed under the pressure of combat conditions. She fired twice, but missed both times, the bullets going high and wide of their intended targets, while precious ammunition was wasted on shots that accomplished nothing except to reveal their position to Pete's men. That was when Pete made his masterstroke, the tactical move that would either end the fight in his favor or force his enemies into a desperate gamble with their own lives. While his remaining men kept up a steady barrage of covering fire to prevent any effective return shots, he circled around behind the women's position and grabbed Helen Beatrice as she tried to reload her small derringer with hands that shook too badly to handle the tiny cartridges effectively. She fought like a wildcat despite her fear and the hopelessness of her situation, clawing at his face with her fingernails and trying to bite the hand he clamped over her mouth. But Pete was too strong and too experienced at subduing struggling women to be seriously inconvenienced by her resistance. Drop your weapons or the schoolmarm gets a bullet in the head. He shouted over the continuing gunfire, pressing his Colt against Helen's temple hard enough to leave a circular bruise, while his eyes searched the rocks for any sign of movement from his remaining enemies. Clara looked toward Atsati, who had reached Walter's position and was trying desperately to stop the bleeding from the farmer's abdominal wound. Knowing even as he worked that such injuries were usually fatal without immediate surgical intervention that was impossible under their current circumstances. Walter was dying, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Helen's life now depended on decisions that would have to be made in the next few seconds. Do what he says. Atsati called, understanding that continuing the fight would only result in Helen's death, followed by their own capture or elimination, while surrender might at least keep them alive long enough for some unexpected opportunity to develop. But as Clara started to lower the Spencer in compliance with Pete's demands, Helen caught her eye and mouthed a single word with desperate urgency: evidence. In that moment, Clara understood what the schoolteacher was trying to communicate. Helen was carrying all their most important documentation in a leather satchel, the shipping manifests, telegraph records, and financial documents that provided proof of Klaus's crimes extending far beyond their personal situation. If that evidence was destroyed, the women in the storage building would disappear without a trace, and Klaus's operation would continue indefinitely. Clara made her choice based on calculations that went beyond immediate survival, to encompass the larger questions of justice and the protection of innocents who had no other hope of rescue. Instead of surrendering, as Pete expected, she rolled sideways into deeper cover among the rocks and kept the rifle ready for whatever opportunity might develop. Smart girl, Pete said with genuine appreciation for her tactical thinking, though his scarred face showed the kind of murderous anticipation that came from having his authority challenged by someone he considered inferior in every way that mattered. But not smart enough to save your friends. He pulled a match from his shirt pocket and held it near the leather satchel Helen carried, the flame dancing in the desert breeze as he prepared to destroy months of careful investigation and documentation. All that paperwork you've been collecting, schoolmarm, let's see how it burns when it meets real fire. The match flared to life, and Pete touched it to the corner of the satchel, which caught fire immediately due to the dry leather and paper contents. Helen wept openly as she watched her work burn months of patient investigation, curling into ash and smoke, while Pete laughed with the cruel satisfaction of someone destroying his enemy's hopes along with their evidence. "Evidence goes to ash," he said, echoing words he had used during their previous encounter, "just like your chances of stopping Klaus or saving those women he's got locked up. Just like your lives, once I get done settling accounts for all the trouble you people have caused." Helen's tears were genuine, but Clara felt something different rising in her chest. Not despair at the loss of their documentation, but a cold, crystalline determination that seemed to burn brighter as the flames consumed the physical proof of Klaus's crimes. The evidence might be gone, but the crimes were still happening, the women were still captives, and Klaus was still planning his shipment to buyers who would make any previous suffering seem mild by comparison. "Then we finish this," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the rocky ground, despite the continuing gunfire and Pete's laughter. "No more hiding, no more running away from what needs to be done. We end Klaus's operation here and now, whatever the cost to ourselves." Atsadi looked up from where Walter Remy had just breathed his last breath, and the old farmer's eyes closing for the final time as blood pooled beneath him on the sun-baked stone. In Clara's face, across the distance that separated them, he saw his own resolve reflected and magnified, the understanding that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds, that some evils could only be stopped by people willing to risk everything for the sake of justice. Pete was still laughing when Clara's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to lose his grip on Helen, who immediately broke free and dove for cover, while Pete's men scrambled to reorganize their positions in response to the sudden resumption of hostilities. But the tactical situation remained desperate. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the sound of gunfire had alerted every man in the mining camp to their presence. As afternoon thunderclouds began building over the high peaks and the first rumbles of distant thunder echoed off the canyon walls, 3 survivors found themselves trapped in a narrow wash, with enemies closing in from all sides, and their only ally dead among the rocks, where he had made his final stand and for justice. Thunder crashed across the ridges as the storm unleashed its full fury, turning dust to treacherous mud within seconds and reducing visibility to mere yards. But Atsadi moved through the deluge as if born to such conditions, leading Clara and Helen toward the mining operation's heart where their enemies waited. The sound of their approach was lost in thunder that seemed to shake mountains' foundations, while rushing water from higher elevations created constant background roar that would mask gunshots or any other sounds of conflict. Already streams of muddy water poured into the main mine entrance, like brown rivers carrying debris from higher country. Within minutes, Atsadi knew from experience lower tunnels would be knee-deep in flash flood building above them. Near the converted prison building, they could hear shouting as guards tried organizing evacuation in driving rain. Lanterns flickered like fireflies in darkness, casting dancing shadows that made determining exact numbers or positions impossible. "They're moving prisoners to the assay office." Atsadi pointed through downpour toward women being herded through mud toward a wooden structure on higher ground. "If Klaus's men get them secured, there will never reach them without prolonged siege." But water was rising faster than anyone anticipated. What had been manageable stream was becoming genuine torrent, entire lower mining level flooding with water that had nowhere to go except deeper into the mountain. Atsadi made a decision that was either tactically brilliant or completely insane. While guards were distracted by evacuation chaos, he worked toward stored mining equipment, looking for tools that might create tactical advantages. He found a heavy mattock and coil of rope abandoned by some fleeing miner. The plan forming in his mind was desperate beyond rational calculation, but their only chance of reaching the women before Klaus consolidated defenses. "Cover me," he told Clara, then plunged down muddy hillside toward the tailings dam, holding back years of accumulated mining waste. Clara didn't understand his strategy until she saw him attacking the earthwork with the mattock cutting channels that would redirect floodwater away from mine entrance toward the assay office where captives were being held. It was backbreaking work in driving rain, made dangerous by lightning striking exposed metal equipment with increasing frequency. Understanding his plan, she tied rope around her waist and waded into the torrent to help guide redirected water flow. The current tried sweeping her away with every step, while muddy water rose past her knees with frightening speed. Together, they managed creating temporary diversion that lowered water around mine entrance, while creating new stream flowing directly past the assay office. It wasn't much advantage, but in their circumstances, small improvements could mean difference between success and catastrophic failure. The mine interior was a labyrinth carved from living rock over decades, lit only by flickering lamps that cast dancing shadows while water dripped constantly and pooled on uneven floors. Flooding had reached ankle depth in most areas, with lower passages completely submerged. Atsadi had entered through a ventilation shaft, dropping into the maze with Spencer slung and Bowie knife ready. The mine was supposed to be abandoned during evacuation, but voices echoed from somewhere in depths, guards ensuring no evidence survived. He moved like a ghost, using techniques learned hunting both animals and men in terrain more challenging than these artificial passages. Every sense alert, every movement calculated to avoid loose rocks and pitfalls that could betray his presence. The first guard was positioned where a side tunnel branched off rifle propped against stone, while he smoked and waited for orders. Atsadi's knife slid between ribs with surgical precision, finding the heart with anatomical knowledge from years' hunting game. The guard died without sound, beyond soft grunt of surprise. From deeper in the maze came frightened women's voices, following the sound through increasingly treacherous terrain where water was now knee-deep. Atsadi reached a natural chamber enlarged to serve as holding area. Through gaps in makeshift wooden door, he could see them 15 women huddled in lamplight, like refugees' faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion clothes, torn and dirty from weeks or months of captivity. Some were white women who had answered Klaus's false advertisements, others Mexican or Apache taken by force. All showed physical and psychological marks of systematic abuse designed to destroy self-worth and ensure compliance. And there, in the far corner, comforting younger women, was the Apache girl he had traveled so far to find. She looked up as he approached, and despite everything endured, managed to smile. "Winona," he said softly in their native language. "Atsadi," she replied, voice barely whisper but filled with relief. "I knew you would come. Even when they said you were dead, I never stopped believing." 2 guards stood between Atsadi and the captives, watching for trouble from main entrance, but not considering someone might approach through side tunnels. Atsadi threw a rock down a connecting passage, where it clattered and splashed, creating needed distraction. Both guards turned toward the sound, and Atsadi put Spencer bullets into their backs with cold efficiency. Clara appeared at his shoulder, having followed through treacherous passages. She had torn dress strips to muffle the rifle's muzzle flash, practical improvisation, showing how quickly she adapted to desperate circumstances. Helen picked the simple lock with bent wire, and the door swung open to reveal captive women shrinking back in terror. But Clara spoke quickly in English, German, and Spanish, explaining they were there to help. The storm was reaching peak intensity when they emerged into a world transformed by meteorological violence that seemed to shake Earth's foundations. Lightning struck continuously, turning night into strobing day, while thunder crashed with force that sent loose rocks tumbling down canyon walls. Mining camp was complete chaos, men running through ankle-deep mud trying to save equipment, while flash flood roared down canyon, carrying away everything not anchored to solid rock. But Klaus had arrived with Sheriff Otto and armed men positioning themselves around the mine headframe like chess pieces, controlling the most direct route to safety. Victor Klaus stood in partial shelter of the wooden tower, expensive clothes soaked, but face showing murderous determination that came from seeing years of planning destroyed by forces beyond control. At 42, he had built his empire through methods combining business acumen with ruthless violence, and he wasn't prepared to see it collapse because of 3 fugitives and a summer storm. Greasy Pete held the tactical key, positioning himself at headframe base with Winona as human shield Colt pressed against her jaw, while his eyes searched storm-lashed darkness for enemies. Pete's face was a ruin of scars and barely controlled rage-wounded arm, forgotten in intensity of hatred for people who had humiliated him repeatedly. "Now come out," Klaus shouted over thunder and rushing water. "You've destroyed everything I built, but this ends now. Surrender, and I'll make your deaths quick." But it was Pete who controlled the moment. "Fair trade," he yelled, scarred features twisting. "Your sister's life for the German woman. Send her out, and maybe we can all walk away." Clara stepped into lamplight, with hands raised, but spine-straight water, streaming from torn dress as she faced men who had made her life systematic hell. She had come so far from the terrified woman bound in Willow Springs that she hardly recognized herself. "Take me," she called to Pete, German accent audible but voice steady with courage that came from having faced the worst evil men could do. "Let her go and take me instead. I'm the one who cost you everything. She's done nothing but be born Apache in a world that hates her for it." Pete's grin split with pure anticipation. This was what he had waited for, chance to break Clara slowly and thoroughly, make her pay for every humiliation. But Atsadi was already moving with deadly grace that had kept him alive, through years of warfare, using storm and confusion to mask his approach as he climbed slick framework of the headframe. Lightning crashed directly overhead. As he reached the catwalk, electrical discharge so close he could smell ozone. In that brilliant illumination, Winona saw her brother's shadow above Pete's position and understood what she needed to do. She bit down hard on Pete's wrist teeth, finding tendons that would cause maximum pain and force him to jerk the pistol away. At the same moment, Atsadi launched himself from 20 feet above, dropping through air with arms outstretched. The collision drove both men to ground with bone-crushing force, and they rolled through mud, fighting with desperate fury. Pete was heavier and more experienced, but Atsadi had surprise advantage and burning need to protect his sister. Clara, seeing Sheriff Otto draw his gun to shoot Atsadi while he grappled with Pete, threw herself at the corrupt lawman with all remaining strength. They crashed into wooden housing sheltering mine's water pump, splintering planks and tearing metal fittings as they struggled for control of Otto's weapon. Dr. Marcel appeared at lamplight's edge, carrying his medical bag and small pocket pistol. He was no gunfighter, but couldn't watch good people die while evil men prospered. His shot at Klaus was poorly aimed, taking the rancher in thigh rather than center mass, but enough to stagger him and spoil his aim. Klaus fired immediately, in return bullet catching Marcel inside and spinning the doctor around. Lightning was almost continuous now, creating strobing nightmare of violence and rain and electricity. Atsadi got hands around Pete's throat and squeezed until struggles weakened and eyes began rolling back. Klaus, wounded but far from finished, was trying to reload when Atsadi grabbed broken timber from damaged headframe and brought it down on Rancher's skull with every ounce of force he could generate. Klaus collapsed face first into mud-expensive clothes, finally ruined, and ambitions permanently ended. Sheriff Otto, still struggling with Clara, managed getting weapon positioned between them and pulled trigger. Bullet grazed Clara's shoulder, tearing cloth and flesh, but missing anything vital. But shock caused her to lose grip momentarily, and Otto was bringing gun around for killing shot when Helen emerged from storm carrying the Spencer. "This is for Walter." she said with calm precision of someone who had moved beyond anger into perfect clarity about what needed doing. And for every woman Klaus destroyed, because good people were too frightened to act. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Otto was driven backward into pump housing wreckage, where he lay motionless. Corruption finally ended. As storm began moving eastward and steady rain replaced torrential downpour, survivors gathered around damaged head frame to assess victory's cost. Klaus was unconscious, but alive, breathing shallow and face gray with shock. Pete was similarly incapacitated, skull fractured, but heart beating steadily. Otto was dead body, already growing cold. Dr. Marcel was badly wounded, but conscious, pressing blood-soaked bandage against bullet hole while Clara worked to bind her own shoulder graze. Winona was free at last, helping Helen tend other rescued women, while they all tried processing what they had survived. And Atsadi stood in the center, sister alive beside him, and enemies defeated or dead, but victory's price written in exhaustion and pain across weathered features. Dawn revealed true destruction scope the storm had wrought, but also brought justice in form of Territorial Marshal Arthur Dietrich and dozen legitimate lawmen who had ridden hard through night responding to reports of violence, and Elias Vance's forced confession after being discovered bound in his store. The marshal was a weathered man in his mid-40s with sharp, intelligent eyes, taking in devastation scene with practiced gaze of someone accustomed to sorting truth from lies in life-and-death situations. Clara had managed grabbing several items from Pump House office during their fight account books, showing payments to corrupt officials, shipping records, documenting systematic transportation of kidnapped women, correspondence between Klaus and associates, revealing full scope of organization operating with impunity for years. These documents show pattern extending far beyond simple kidnapping. Clara explained, handing soggy but legible papers to Marshall. Klaus wasn't just forcing women into local captivity. He was building inventory for California buyers who paid premium prices for what they considered exotic specimens. Marshal Dietrich examined evidence, carefully, expression growing grimmer with each page, as Klaus's enterprise scope became clear. The shipping manifests alone documented dozens of women's movement over 2 years, while financial records showed payments revealing business operation generating substantial profits from human suffering. Judge Dietrich will need to see all this, he said, referring to his cousin serving as territorial judge. Federal authorities will investigate interstate aspects. As morning progressed and Marshall's men worked, securing the scene, survivors began processing what they had accomplished and what it would mean for their futures. 6 weeks later, autumn air carried crisp bite as Clara walked through Prairie Rose Cemetery, where leaves had turned old gold color. Walter Remy's simple cedar post bore only his name and dates, but Clara had brought wild asters gathered from hillside where he made his final stand. She knelt beside grave and placed purple blooms at weathered marker base, thinking about farmer who died protecting strangers because it was right. In her reticule was money donations from townspeople who remembered Walter as honest man. "It's not much," she said aloud, though no one else was within hearing. "But it will help Mary and the boy through their first Kansas winter." The trial had drawn territorial attention, revealing corruption patterns, allowing Klaus's enterprise to flourish. Victor Klaus had received 15 years hard labor, his properties seized to compensate victims. Pete got 20 years for kidnapping and assault. Both were transported to territorial prison in leg irons. But the trial had also revealed something else: Judge Dietrich's offer of a position as territorial advocate for women's legal rights, with authority to investigate complaints and represent female victims in courts. Clara found herself standing outside her seamstress shop as evening approached, where Atsadi waited with news that would shape their future together. "Winona sends greetings," he said, warming hands around coffee mug. She's doing well at Homestead near Owl Canyon, raising horses and weaving baskets that sell to Eastern tourists. What about you? Clara asked, studying his weathered face. Marshal Dietrich's offer for territorial scout position. Important work tracking criminals in remote areas. Dangerous, but necessary. He pulled out a folded document land claim form Helen had discovered, showing Walter had found legal errors in Klaus's water rights acquisition. Judge Dietrich ruled Klaus's claim invalid. Walter's family gets $8,000, enough for substantial Kansas farm and boys' education. The news brought tears to Clara's eyes. Justice finally done proof that Walter's fight hadn't been meaningless. As they sat in comfortable silence that had developed between them, Clara reflected on extraordinary transformation she had undergone. The frightened woman bound in Willow Springs was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered strength, courage, and determination she never suspected possessing. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" she asked, meeting his dark eyes across the work table where lamplight created intimate warmth. "About me being yours and under your protection." "I said it to protect you from crowd violence and Klaus's revenge plans. In Apache culture, claiming protection creates obligations lasting as long as need exists." "And does that need still exist?" Atsadi considered carefully. "You're not the same person who needed protection. You've become partner rather than someone requiring constant protection. But some obligations grow and change over time." He continued, voice carrying careful thought and genuine emotion. "They transform from duties imposed by circumstances into commitments chosen freely by people who have come to value and respect each other through shared experiences." Clara felt her heart begin beating faster, not with fear, but with anticipation for possibilities growing between them as they worked together, helping other rescued women and seeking justice. "I've been thinking about that transformation too," she admitted. "About difference between relationships born from necessity and those developing into something chosen by people who have seen each other's true character under most challenging circumstances." Before Atsadi could respond, Helen entered with news from telegraph office. Federal authorities had made additional arrests based on Klaus operation evidence. 3 more territorial judges, railroad executive, and customs officials facilitating interstate transportation. "Judge Dietrich wants to offer you official appointment as territorial advocate for women's legal rights," Helen announced, producing formal commission. "New position created specifically in response to what your case revealed about systematic exploitation." Clara studied commission carefully, understanding full implications. Position would require travel throughout territory investigating complaints where women might have no other help, representing victims in courts where female testimony was often dismissed. The decision came easily. "I accept," she said simply, understanding she had discovered her true calling during crucible of desperate circumstances and could not walk away from opportunity to help others still trapped. As Helen explained position details, Atsadi thought about how this development would affect plans they had been discussing. Territorial scout position would take him away for weeks, while Clara's advocacy role would require extensive travel. But their work could complement each other, his tracking skills valuable in reaching remote areas where women might be held, while her legal authority could ensure evidence was properly preserved. "We could work together," Clara said, reading his thoughts. "Your scouting work and my advocacy position would naturally overlap in cases involving crimes against women where regular law enforcement never goes. A partnership." Atsadi agreed, word carrying both professional and personal connotations, speaking to their relationship evolution from desperate necessity to mutual respect and genuine affection. based on complementary skills and shared commitment rather than other considerations. "And what about those other considerations?" Helen asked with gentle teasing. "Are nobody's business but ours." Clara replied firmly, though her smile made clear those considerations were developing satisfactorily. As evening deepened, three friends shared Helen's meal, while discussing plans that would shape their futures and broader cause of justice throughout Arizona territory. The seamstress shop would continue providing Clara income and operations base, but would also serve as unofficial office where women could seek help without fear. Atsadi's territorial scout work would give him mobility and authority investigating crimes where no other law enforcement could reach, while Helen would continue teaching with additional credibility from her role exposing Klaus's organization. Together, they represented something new, a network committed to protecting vulnerable and challenging powerful regardless of personal cost. They had proven courage and determination could triumph over wealth and corruption when good people refused accepting injustice as inevitable. The final surprise came next morning when Judge Dietrich arrived with portfolio containing revelations that exceeded even corruption charges from Klaus's trial. While sorting seized records, Helen had discovered metal strongbox containing genuine territorial seal stolen years earlier and used authenticating thousands of fraudulent documents, transferring legitimate homesteads' water rights and mining claims to Klaus through systematic theft disguised as legal proceedings. "We've documented 17 separate fraud cases involving properties worth tens of thousands stolen from legitimate homesteaders through forged papers." Judge Dietrich explained, spreading maps showing true scope of Klaus's land-grabbing operations. Most significant discovery involved Walter's homestead genuine survey records showed his original claim had been much larger than realized, encompassing not just spring, Klaus coveted, but substantial mineral-rich ground illegally incorporated into Klaus's mining operations. Walter's widow and son are entitled to compensation not just for water rights, but for years of illegal mining on their property. Judge Dietrich continued, "Territorial government will pay approximately $8,000 enough for substantial Kansas farm and boys' education through university." But there was more official appointment as Commission's chief investigator with authority examining records, taking testimony, and recommending prosecutions for fraud cases extending back years before Klaus's organization was exposed. Clara stared at Commission in amazement, hardly believing she was being offered such responsibility after beginning territorial time as victim with no legal rights. Position would complement her women's advocate work while addressing broader corruption patterns that made Klaus's crimes possible. "The salary is substantial enough to support both advocacy work and any domestic arrangements you might choose," Judge Dietrich said with knowing smile. "And authority extends throughout territory, coordinating well with your partner's scouting duties." As afternoon sun streamed through shop windows, Clara signed papers, making her territory's first female legal advocate and chief land fraud investigator. Outside, Willow Springs continued daily business, but for Clara, everything had changed in ways transcending official titles. She had found her place through courage and determination and willingness to fight for justice, regardless of personal cost. In finding that place, she had discovered partner who would share it, man, who had seen her at weakest moment and helped her discover strength she hadn't known she possessed, who had offered protection when needed and partnership when ready. The frontier remained harsh, justice imperfect, and there would always be people like Klaus seeking to exploit vulnerable for profit. But there would also be people like Clara and Atsadi Helen and Dr. Marcel and Walter Remy, who refused accepting injustice as inevitable and were willing to fight for something better. As shadows lengthened and evening star appeared in darkening sky, Clara closed commission papers and prepared locking shop for another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to make difference in lives of people forgotten by those with power to help, but not will to act. But tonight belonged to her and Man, who had become her partner in every sense that truly mattered. Tonight was for planning their future as equals in land that didn't always recognize such equality, for celebrating victories won against impossible odds, and for acknowledging love that had grown not despite harsh circumstances, but because of strength and character those circumstances revealed. In harsh arithmetic of frontier, where survival was never guaranteed and justice always uncertain, that was victory enough for any lifetime. They had found each other, saved lives that might otherwise have been lost, and proven that sometimes courage and determination could triumph over wealth and power when good people refused accepting evil as inevitable. The beadwork strip now lay in place of honor in Clara's shop, intricate patterns catching last light, while serving as reminder of how far they had come since that desperate night when truth emerged in terrible scope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve justice. But tonight was for celebrating bonds forged in fire and tested by adversity, bonds that would endure whatever trials future might bring to Arizona territory and people who had chosen to make it their home.